A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. So, Daniel sent us this one, and I'll just read it out because it captures the mood perfectly. He writes, if the Iran war felt unclear up to now, we're suddenly mired in a dense fog. As talks in Islamabad begin, it seems unclear what they are attempting to build on. Trump says the Strait of Hormuz is open. Then Iran says it can't find the mines it just laid. Netanyahu claims victory of sorts, but otherwise keeps his population in the dark about what's happening. We've reached essentially an information blackout. The Israeli population is firmly against a ceasefire. The question on everybody's mind and lips is, what's happening? Herman and Korn, what's your read on what we're seeing reported? I'm Korn Puppleberry, and that question is exactly where we need to start.
Because here's the thing that stopped me cold when I read that. We have a war where one combatant can't locate its own mines. The other is declaring victory without telling anyone what that means. And the guy brokering peace is posting on Truth Social about open straits. And yet somehow, this is the phase where we're supposed to be building toward resolution. That is a remarkable sentence to have to say out loud.
The framing I keep coming back to is this. The information blackout isn't a side effect of the conflict. It is a layer of the conflict. It's doing active work. And once you see it that way, the contradictions stop looking like chaos and start looking like architecture.
Before we get into the mechanics of that, let's just quickly establish where we actually are on the ground, because I think it's worth naming the specific contradictions Daniel is pointing at. We've got talks in Islamabad that started on April 10th. J.D. Vance flew in with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Iran's Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf arrives, and his opening statement is, roughly, "We have good intentions, but we do not trust." That is not a warm handshake to start a negotiation.
And then layer on top of that the ceasefire that isn't really a ceasefire. Trump announced a truce on April 7th, but Israel and Hezbollah aren't party to it. The day before the Islamabad talks started, Israel reported killing 180 Hezbollah fighters in a single day. Hezbollah launched 72 strikes into Israel on April 9th alone. So while Diplomats is shaking hands in Pakistan, the proxy war is running hot. The ceasefire is a label applied to a document that doesn't describe the actual situation.
And then there's Trump on April 9th posting on Truth Social that the Strait of Hormuz is open. Meanwhile, maritime tracking data shows roughly 12 ships passed through in the first 48 hours of the so-called ceasefire. Pre-war, that number was 129 per day, so the strait is open, the way a door with a landmine in the threshold is open. Technically, sure.
And that's the mine problem, which is genuinely one of the stranger developments in recent memory. Iran is now signaling it cannot find the mines it laid during the height of the naval conflict. And they propose what's being called a Hormuz toll, where Tehran would charge vessels a fee to guarantee safe passage through waters it has mined. That is, in the most literal sense, a protection racket applied to global energy infrastructure.
I want to sit with that for a second because it's almost too on the nose. We've mined your sea lane, we can't find the mines, but pay us and we'll try our best. That's the deal. That is the deal being offered to global shipping.
And by the way, it's working as an economic weapon regardless of whether any individual mine ever detonates. The threat is the weapon. U.S. inflation hit 3.3% in March, driven almost entirely by the energy shock. Farm diesel in the U.S. Midwest has gone from $1.89 per gallon in December to $4.17 now. That's more than double in roughly 4 months. The mines don't need to sink a ship to cause real damage.
So let's get into the mechanism you were describing, because I think this is where the analysis gets genuinely interesting. You said the blackout is doing active work. Walk me through what that actually means tactically.
So there's a concept in information warfare called the OOD loop: observe, orient, decide, act. It was developed by military strategist John Boyd, and the basic idea is that whoever can cycle through that loop faster than their adversary controls the tempo of a conflict. Now, strategic ambiguity, which is what we're watching in real time, is essentially a denial of service attack on the adversary's ability to complete that loop. If your opponent can't get reliable information about what you've done, what you have, and what you intend, they can't orient correctly, which means they can't decide correctly, which means their actions are either delayed or miscalibrated.
So when Iran says we can't find the mines, that statement is doing multiple things simultaneously.
At least 4 things. First, it creates genuine operational uncertainty for anyone trying to transit the strait. Second, it gives Iran plausible deniability for any future incidents. Third, it signals to the Islamabad negotiators that any agreement has to include a mine clearance provision, which gives Iran a bargaining chip they didn't have to formally declare. And fourth, it prevents the US from being able to say the strait is definitively safe, which means Trump's Truth Social declaration becomes a political statement rather than a verifiable fact.
That fourth one is interesting because it puts Trump in a bind. He's made the claim. He's locked in the narrative. Now, if a ship hits a mine, that's not just a maritime incident, it's a direct contradiction of a presidential statement.
And that's exactly the dynamic you want if you're Iran's negotiating team. You force your counterpart to either defend an unprovable positive or publicly walk back a declaration. Either outcome costs Trump something. The "I can't find the mine" statement isn't an admission of incompetence. It's a move.
It's worth distinguishing this from what we might call accidental fog of war, because I think people conflate those two things. Historical fog of war is what happens when communications break down, when units lose contact, when the picture is genuinely incomplete because the battlefield is chaotic. What we're watching here is different.
The difference is intent and design. In the Gulf War in 1991, the U.S. military maintained extraordinary information control, but the mechanism was different. It was primarily about preventing adversaries from understanding coalition capabilities and movements before the ground offensive. The information void was created by speed and operational security. What's happening now is more layered. You have Iran's internet blackouts, which NetBlocks is now reporting has exceeded 1,000 hours of total shutdown. 1,000 hours. That's not operational security for a military campaign. That's a sustained effort to prevent a civilian population from forming independent views about what their government is doing.
And Israel's opacity, while different in mechanism, is serving a similar function. Netanyahu declares victory. No operational specifics, no timeline, no definition of what victory actually means in measurable terms. The Israeli public doesn't know what was agreed in Islamabad, doesn't know the scope of what's been traded, and according to what we're seeing in domestic sentiment polling, is firmly against any ceasefire that doesn't include the total dismantling of Hezbollah. So you have a government that is potentially heading toward a deal that its own population would reject, and the strategy for managing that gap is information control.
And this is where it gets genuinely complicated from an analytical standpoint. Because you have to ask, is Netanyahu's opacity protecting a negotiating position, or is it masking a position that is fundamentally untenable to sell domestically? Those are different problems with different implications.
If it's the former, that's standard diplomatic tradecraft. You don't telegraph your negotiating floor before you sit down. But if it's the latter, you're looking at a situation where the agreement that ends the shooting might also trigger a domestic political crisis in Israel.
And the Islamabad talks themselves reflect this ambiguity. The talks started on April 10th with no publicly stated agenda. Think about what that means. You have the Vice President of the United States, a senior envoy in Witkoff, and Jared Kushner flying to Pakistan to meet Iranian counterparts, and the public framing is essentially, we're talking. There's no declared framework, no announced topics. When Galibaf says Iran has preconditions, specifically a total ceasefire in Lebanon and the unfreezing of Iranian assets, and those preconditions are not met before the talks begin, what are the talks actually building toward?
It sounds less like a negotiation and more like both sides showing up to be seen, showing up.
which is itself strategically valuable. The performance of negotiation has independent value from the substance of negotiation. It signals to allies, to markets, to the domestic audiences of both countries that there is a pathway out. That signal suppresses certain escalatory pressures. It buys time. Whether it produces a durable agreement is a separate question.
Before we move on, I want to flag something that I think is underreported in the coverage we've been seeing. The Ukrainian angle. Zelensky confirmed that Ukrainian units have been operating in the Middle East, using their experience with Shahed drones to help other states intercept Iranian projectiles, in exchange for fuel and financial aid. That is a remarkable detail that got almost no traction.
It tells you something important about how this conflict has become a technology transfer event. Ukraine has built more operational experience countering Shahed drones than almost any other military. The fact that that expertise is now being deployed in the Middle East, in exchange for resources Ukraine desperately needs, shows you how the conflict has created an informal market for specific military competencies. And it complicates the information picture further, because now you have Ukrainian operators in theater whose presence is not officially acknowledged by any of the primary parties.
Another layer of fog. By the way, Claude's Sonnet 4.6 is generating today's script, and I think it's doing a reasonable job of navigating a situation where the facts themselves are contested, which is on brand for the topic.
The Palantir detail is worth mentioning here too, because it's another data point about the information layer of this conflict. Trump publicly praised Palantir Technologies on Truth Social for its warfighting capabilities in the Iran conflict. Shortly after that, Iran officially threatened to target Palantir's assets. That is a threat against a private technology company by a nation-state, in public, in response to a presidential endorsement. The targeting of information infrastructure, and the companies that provide it, is now an explicit element of the conflict's grammar.
Let's talk about the second-order effects, because I think this is where the real implications start to land for people who are trying to understand what comes next. What does operating in this level of opacity actually do to the people and systems that depend on accurate information?
Starting with intelligence analysis, because this is where the fog creates compounding problems. When official statements are deliberately unreliable, analysts have to weight them differently. You can't just pass what a government says. You have to model the gap between what they say and what the physical evidence suggests. The 12 ships versus 129 ships discrepancy is a perfect example. Trump says the strait is open. Shipping data says it isn't. An analyst working that problem has to answer not just what is true, but why is the gap this large, and what does the gap itself tell me about intent?
And that kind of analysis is expensive in time and resources. It delays decisions, which means the fog achieves its purpose even against sophisticated observers.
Ally coordination is the other major casualty. When the U.S. says the strait is open and shipping data disagrees, U.S. allies who depend on that strait for energy imports have to make real decisions. Do they send tankers? Do they reroute? Do they negotiate separately with Iran? Every day of ambiguity has a direct cost. The European energy situation, which was already stressed after the Ukraine conflict, is watching oil prices move on the basis of statements that may or may not reflect reality.
And then there's the civilian dimension, which I think gets underweighted in this kind of analysis because it's harder to quantify. Iran's population has been cut off from international news for over 1,000 hours. What does that actually mean for the people living through it?
It means the domestic narrative inside Iran is entirely state-controlled. The version of events that Iranians have access to is the version the government has chosen to provide. And historically, that kind of information environment makes it very difficult for populations to form accurate assessments of their own government's performance, which in turn makes it harder for any internal pressure to develop that might push toward a different policy. The blackout isn't just preventing outside information from getting in, it's preventing an accurate internal accounting from forming.
The Israeli situation is different, but the structural dynamic has some parallels. Israeli media is free. Israeli civil society is vocal, but the specific details of what's being negotiated in Islamabad are being withheld. And the public sentiment we're seeing, firmly against a ceasefire that doesn't eliminate Hezbollah, puts the government in a position where any compromise short of that looks like a betrayal of the war's stated objectives.
And this is the tension that I think is most likely to produce the next major disruption. Netanyahu has declared victory. The public has internalized a certain definition of what victory means. If the Islamabad talks produce an agreement that falls short of that definition, the political cost at home is enormous. But the alternative, holding out for total Hezbollah dismantlement, is an objective that no ceasefire agreement with Iran is going to deliver, because Iran doesn't have full command and control over Hezbollah's military structure in the way that would make we agree to dismantle them a meaningful commitment.
So the gap between the public expectation and the achievable outcome is itself a product of the information management. Netanyahu shaped the narrative of victory, and now that narrative is constraining his options.
That's the trap of narrative locking. It's a real phenomenon. You control the story early, you gain short-term political benefit, but you also create a constraint on your future negotiating range. The victory declaration on April 10th serves to consolidate domestic support, but it also sets a benchmark that any subsequent agreement will be measured against. And the more specific the victory claim, the harder it is to accept anything less without it looking like a climb down.
Kamala Harris called this a war of choice, recently, and specifically went after Trump's earlier claims that he had obliterated Iran's nuclear arsenal during his first term. That framing is interesting because it's doing the same thing in reverse. It's trying to retroactively redefine the success criteria so that the current situation looks like a failure against a standard that Trump himself set.
That's information warfare operating in the domestic political space rather than the military space, but the mechanism is identical. You're trying to control what benchmark the outcome is measured against. Trump said the arsenal was gone. Harris is pointing to the ongoing conflict as evidence it wasn't. The person who wins that framing contest influences how the eventual settlement is perceived.
And the Pope is in this conversation too, which is not a sentence I expected to say. Pope Leo XIV issued a condemnation specifically criticizing those who drop bombs in the lands of early Christianity, naming Iraq and Lebanon. That's a moral framing that cuts across the political framing in an interesting way. The Vatican isn't weighing in on whether the nuclear program was dismantled. It's asserting a different set of criteria entirely.
It's a reminder that the information environment around this conflict isn't just two parties and a mediator. It's a genuinely global conversation with multiple competing frameworks for what the conflict means, what success looks like, and who bears responsibility. The fog isn't just tactical. It's also the product of having too many incompatible narratives operating simultaneously.
Let's turn to what this actually means for people trying to follow this in real time, because I think Daniel's underlying question is a practical one. He's asking, what are we actually watching? And I think part of the honest answer is, we're watching information warfare as a primary domain of the conflict, not a secondary one.
Right, and the practical implication of that is that you have to treat official statements from all parties as signals rather than facts. This is a specific analytical posture, and it's worth being explicit about what it means. When Trump says the strait is open, the useful question isn't, is he right? The useful question is, what is this statement trying to accomplish? And what does the gap between the statement and physical reality tell me about where the pressure is?
When Iran says it can't find the mines, the useful question isn't how did they lose track of their own mines? It's what does this claim give them that a straightforward, we have mines and will clear them on our terms doesn't?
The answer to that second question is plausible deniability on future incidents, a bargaining chip in Islamabad that doesn't have to be formally declared, and a lever on global shipping that operates through fear rather than enforcement. The can't find them framing is more useful than the we have them and we're holding them framing, even if the underlying reality is the same.
Source triangulation is the other thing I want to emphasize here because it's genuinely the most practical tool available to anyone trying to navigate this. The 12 ships versus 129 ships discrepancy is knowable from public maritime tracking data. That's not intelligence. That's a public data source that contradicts an official statement. Satellite imagery of ports, shipping, AIS data, energy price movements, these are real-time ground truth sources that don't depend on what any government says.
The energy price data is particularly useful because it's a large, liquid market with strong incentives for accuracy. When farm diesel in the Midwest doubles in 4 months, that's a signal about what the market actually believes about energy availability, regardless of what any official statement says about the strait's status. Markets are imperfect, but they're harder to manipulate than press releases.
There's also the question of timing. Information blackouts are temporary. The pressure on them is constant from journalists, from satellite operators, from market participants who need accurate information to make decisions. The question isn't whether the fog lifts, it's what narrative has solidified by the time it does.
And that's the mechanism that makes early narrative control so valuable. The first version of events that achieves broad circulation tends to anchor subsequent assessments, even when later information contradicts it. Trump's obliterated claim from his first term is still doing work in the current political conversation years after it was made. Netanyahu's victory declaration from April 10th will shape how the eventual settlement is perceived regardless of what the settlement actually contains. The goal isn't to be accurate. The goal is to be first and to be memorable.
Which is a deeply uncomfortable thing to say about how modern conflicts are understood by their own populations, but I think it's accurate.
The 1991 Gulf War comparison is instructive here. The U.S. military's information control in that conflict was extraordinary, but it operated primarily through access restriction. Journalists were embedded with units, briefings were managed, imagery was controlled, the mechanism was gatekeeping. What's happening now is different in kind, not just degree. You have a 1,000-hour internet shutdown. You have social media platforms operating in real time. You have satellite imagery available commercially. You have AIS shipping data. You have Substack and Telegram channels run by people in theater. The information environment is much harder to control, which means the strategies have evolved. You're not trying to prevent information from existing. You're trying to ensure that your version of events is louder, stickier, and more emotionally resonant than the contradicting version.
That's actually a harder problem than gatekeeping in some ways. You can shut down a press pool, you can't shut down a satellite.
Which is why the Can't Find the Mines framing is so sophisticated. It doesn't try to suppress the information that the Strait isn't functioning normally. It provides an explanation for that information that serves Iranian interests. The shipping data that contradicts Trump's statement isn't being hidden. Iran is providing a narrative frame for it. Yes, the Strait is disrupted. Here's why. And here's what you need to do about it, which involves paying us.
So what does all of this mean for the trajectory of the conflict? If you're looking at the Islamabad talks, the ceasefire that isn't quite a ceasefire, the public sentiment in Israel, the mine situation, what's the shape of what comes next?
There are a few pressure points that I think are most likely to produce the next significant development. The mine situation has a physical clock on it. Global shipping can't operate at 12 ships per day through the Hormuz indefinitely. The economic pressure on the US, on Europe, on Asian energy importers is going to force resolution one way or another. Either Iran demonstrates it can clear the mines, or the US and allied navies do it, or the Hormuz toll gets formalized into some kind of arrangement that everyone pretends isn't what it is.
Each of those outcomes has different implications for who looks like they won.
The mine clearance scenario is the most face-saving for everyone. Iran finds the mines, clears them, the strait reopens, Trump can say his pressure worked, Iran can say it demonstrated its capability, and chose to stand down. The Hormuz toll scenario is the most economically consequential because it normalizes Iranian leverage over global energy infrastructure in a way that's very hard to walk back. And the Allied clearance scenario is the most escalatory because it requires direct action in Iranian territorial waters.
The Lebanon dimension is the other open thread. Israel's stated position is no ceasefire without Hezbollah's dismantlement. Hezbollah launched 72 strikes in a single day during the ceasefire period. The Islamabad talks have Lebanon as an Iranian precondition. These threads are all pulling in different directions simultaneously.
And the information blackout makes it very hard to know which thread is actually load-bearing. Is the Lebanon fighting a deliberate signal from Israel that it won't accept the Islamabad framework? Is it Hezbollah acting outside of Iranian direction? Is it a deliberate provocation designed to collapse the talks? All three of those interpretations are consistent with the available information, and the answer matters enormously for what comes next.
The open question I keep coming back to is whether the fog lifts before or after the next kinetic event. Because if the talks collapse and there's a significant military action, the narrative that was laid during the blackout becomes the foundation for how that action is understood, and by then, the window for a different framing has closed.
That's the core risk of this phase. The information architecture being built right now, through declarations of victory, through can't find the mines, framings, through ceasefire labels applied to active conflicts, that architecture is going to shape how whatever happens next is interpreted. And the populations that are most cut off from independent information, the Iranian public with 1,000 hours of internet blackout, the Israeli public that doesn't know the Islamabad agenda, are the ones with the least ability to contest that architecture before it hardens.
Let's bring it home. If you're a listener trying to navigate this, what do you actually do with all of this?
3 things, practically. First, treat the gap between official statements and physical evidence as the signal, not the noise. The 12 versus 129 ships discrepancy is more informative than anything any government has said about the strait. When you see a gap like that, don't ask who's right. Ask what is the gap doing.
Second thing.
Second, when a government declares victory without specifying what victory means in operational terms, understand that the vagueness is the point. It's not an oversight. A victory declaration without benchmarks is a narrative instrument, not an information statement. The question to ask is, what does this declaration prevent? What options does it foreclose for the declarer and for their adversary?
And the third one is the triangulation point.
Cross-reference official statements with sources that have strong incentives for accuracy. Energy prices, shipping data, currency movements, insurance rates for vessels transiting the strait. These markets are processing the same information you are, but with money on the line, which concentrates the incentive to be right. When the market says one thing and the press release says another, the market is usually closer to the truth. Not always, but usually.
The thing I'll add is just a calibration note. The fog we're describing isn't unique to this conflict. It's the operating environment of modern geopolitical conflict. Every significant confrontation of the last decade has had this layer. What makes this one particularly acute is the speed, the number of parties, and the global economic stakes of the Hormuz situation. But the analytical tools are the same: signal versus noise, gap analysis, source triangulation. Those work regardless of the specific theater.
And the fog does lift. It always does. The question is whether you've built the right analytical habits to evaluate what you see when it does, rather than just accepting the narrative that was laid during a blackout.
Will the Islamabad talks produce anything durable? I genuinely don't know. I don't think anyone does, including the people in the room. What I'm fairly confident of is that whatever comes out of it, the framing laid in the last 10 days is going to shape how it's received. And that framing was built in the dark.
That's the thesis of this whole phase. The fog isn't a failure of communication, it's the communication.
On that note, thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the ship moving. Big thanks to Modal for the GPU credits that make this whole operation run. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you want to follow us on Spotify, we're there. Just search My Weird Prompts. Stay skeptical of the gap between what's said and what the data shows.
We'll see you next time.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth